A 4-year-old girl was burning alive from the inside, and her father hadn't slept in 3 days. He had nothing left. No farm, no wife, no hope. Only cracked boots, a dying child on his back, and the kind of stubbornness that refuses to lie down even when the ground is calling. Wyoming, 1888. The wilderness doesn't care about your grief. It doesn't care about your daughter's fever or the fact that you've been walking since before sunrise through wind cold enough to split stone. Then, a ranch, smoke rising from a chimney, a woman standing in the doorway with a rifle and no patience for strangers. What happened next? Nobody in that territory ever forgot. If this story grabs you, stay with us until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The fever started on a Tuesday. Gideon Mercer noticed it the way you notice a leak in a roof. First as something small, something you tell yourself isn't serious, something that can wait until morning. Elsie had been quiet during the wagon ride west, but she was always quiet after her mother died. Quiet had become the child's natural state, like a bird that had simply stopped singing. He'd written off her silence as grief. He'd written off the warmth of her small forehead against his neck as the afternoon heat. He was wrong on both counts, and by the time he understood that, the wagon was gone. The wagon had been their last real possession. He'd traded it, along with the mule and nearly everything packed inside, for 2 nights at a roadside inn in Rawlins, when the fever spiked hard enough to make Elsie's teeth chatter even in a warm room. He'd sat beside her cot for 48 hours straight, pressing wet rags to her face, watching her chest rise and fall with that awful shallow rhythm that terrified him, telling her stories about her mother in a low voice because he didn't know what else to do. The innkeeper's wife had looked in on them twice, each time leaving with an expression that told him she wasn't sure the child would last the week. Elsie lasted. Gideon had expected her to, in the desperate, irrational way a man expects things when he has no other option. On the 3rd morning, she opened her eyes and said, "Papa, I'm thirsty." He'd wept then, quietly, with his face turned toward the wall so she wouldn't see. He pressed the back of his wrist against his mouth and breathed through it until the shaking stopped. And then he turned around and told her he'd get her water right away, as if nothing had happened. She'd looked at him with those big dark eyes, her mother's eyes exactly, and said, "You smell bad, Papa." "Yeah," he said, "I know." The fever broke, but it didn't leave. It retreated the way a stubborn army retreats, pulling back just far enough to give you hope before settling in for a longer siege. Elsie could sit up, she could drink broth, but she was pale in a way that scared him, pale the way paper gets when it's been left in the rain, and her small body had grown so light that when he lifted her, she barely registered any weight at all. He had no money left after the inn. That was the plain fact of it. He had the clothes on his back, a canvas pack containing a single change of clothes for each of them, a bone-handled hunting knife that had belonged to his father, and approximately $4.30 in coin, money he'd been hoarding since Rawlins, unwilling to spend it until he absolutely had to, because he'd learned by then that absolutely had to could always get worse. He had no wagon, no horse, no clear destination, and a 4-year-old child who needed rest, warmth, regular food, and milk. The milk was the thing that haunted him. The innkeeper's wife had told him plain, before they left. The child needs milk every day for at least 2 weeks. Not water, not broth. Milk. Something about building the blood back up after a fever like that one. She'd said it with the blunt authority of a woman who had buried children and knew the signs. Get her to a proper place, she'd added, meaning somewhere with livestock, somewhere with a kitchen, somewhere that wasn't the open Wyoming wilderness in October. He'd thanked her. He'd walked out the door with Elsie on his back. That was 3 days ago. Wyoming in late October is not a place that forgives poor planning. Gideon had lived on the plains long enough to know this, had worked enough harvest seasons in Kansas and Nebraska to understand what the wind felt like when it turned serious, and the wind had been serious for 2 days straight. It came down from the north in long, low sweeps, cutting right through his coat as if the coat were made of paper, and he could feel it against the back of his neck where Elsie's small hands were locked around him, her fingers cold even through the collar of his shirt. He tried to keep her warm with his own body heat, tilting his head slightly so she was shielded from the worst of the wind, talking to her constantly so she'd stay awake. She was awake, mostly. She drifted in and out, her forehead resting against the back of his neck, sometimes murmuring things he couldn't quite make out, sometimes going very quiet in a way that made him reach back every 15 minutes to check that she was still breathing. She was always still breathing. He thanked, well, he was glad of it each time. The country they were crossing was high, open grassland broken by draws and coulees, and the occasional cluster of cottonwoods marking a creek bed. The mountains were visible to the west, close enough to look at and far enough to be useless. There had been a homestead 2 days back, a sod house with smoke coming from it, and Gideon had knocked. A man had opened the door about 4 inches, looked at them, and said he had nothing to spare. Gideon had said he wasn't asking for charity, just work. Anything, a day's labor for a meal and some milk for the child. The man had looked at Elsie's face, which was flushed and damp and unmistakably sick, and he'd closed the door. Gideon had stood there for a moment. Then he'd turned around and kept walking. There were other ranches out here. He knew that. He'd asked in Rawlins before leaving and been told there was a string of spreads east of the mountains, places that had survived the '87 winter and come back stronger, places that ran cattle and kept dairy cows and employed ranch hands seasonal. He was heading for one of those, or so he hoped. The directions he'd been given were the vague kind that people gave when they assumed you had a horse. Go north along the creek, take the fork east past the big butte, follow the fence line. He'd been following fence lines and creeks and buttes for 3 days and had seen exactly one homestead which had shut its door in his face. His boots had a split along the right sole that let cold water in whenever he crossed wet ground. His lower back had stopped aching on the second day. He wasn't sure if that meant he'd pushed through the pain or if something had simply gone numb. He suspected the second one. He sang to Elsie sometimes when she got restless. Old songs, the ones her mother used to sing. Nothing complicated, nothing that required much breath, just the steady rhythm of familiar words. Oh, Susanna, sweet Betsy from Pike, home on the range. Elsie would press her chin into his shoulder and sometimes hum along, a thin, reedy sound, barely there, but present. It kept him moving, that sound. He sang badly and knew it and didn't care. On the third day, around what he guessed was mid-afternoon by the position of the sun, he came over a long, rolling rise and saw the ranch below him. It sat in a shallow valley, maybe half a mile off, a proper spread. A 2-story house, a substantial barn, several outbuildings, a series of fenced paddocks, and what appeared to be a well-maintained corral. The fences were in good repair. The roof of the barn was solid. There was smoke coming from the chimney of the house, and as he stood on the ridge with the wind at his back, he thought he could smell it. Wood smoke, and beneath it, something cooking. His stomach turned over in a way that made him briefly dizzy. Elsie. He reached back and touched her leg. You awake? She said. There's a ranch, down there in the valley. He was talking to himself as much as to her. We're going to go down there. Okay, Papa. You feeling all right? A pause. My tummy hurts. I know, sweetheart. We're going to get you something to eat soon. He said it the way he'd been saying it for 3 days, with a confidence he didn't feel because there was nothing else you could say. Then he started down the slope. The walk down took about 20 minutes. By the time he reached the flat ground approaching the ranch, his legs were shaking. Not dramatically, not in any way a person would necessarily notice, but he could feel it in his knees, that fine trembling that comes when muscles have been past their limit for too long and are simply refusing to acknowledge it anymore. He focused on the smoke from the chimney. He focused on putting one boot in front of the other. The split sole let in a trickle of cold mud, and he ignored it. The house was bigger up close than it had seemed from the ridge. 2 solid stories of pine timber, weathered gray but well kept, with a covered porch running along the front. There were flowers, or what had been flowers, dead now in the October cold, but clearly tended within the last season, the bed still neat, the plants cut back properly rather than just left to freeze. He noticed the wagon parked beside the barn, canvas covered and secured properly. He noticed the horses in the paddock, 3 of them, all sound-looking animals. He noticed the firewood stacked high and tight along the side of the house under a roof overhang. Enough wood for a long winter, stacked by someone who knew exactly how much they'd need. This wasn't a failing homestead, Whoever ran this place knew what they were doing. He stepped up onto the porch and knocked. The woman who opened the door was not what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said clearly what he had expected. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, taller than average, with dark hair pulled back severely, and the kind of face that hadn't wasted much time on softness. Not cruel, not cold exactly, but weathered in the same way the house was weathered, with an economy to every feature that said she'd stopped concerning herself with unnecessary things some time ago. She was wearing a plain work dress and an apron, and she had a dish towel thrown over one shoulder. She did not have a rifle. He was grateful for that. She looked at him for about 2 seconds, at his ruined boots, his 3 days of beard, the pack on his back, and then she looked past him at the yard, checking, he realized, whether he was alone. "I'm alone," he said, before she could ask. "Just me and my daughter." Her eyes came back to his face. "Your daughter?" "On my back. He hesitated. "She's been sick. Fever. It broke, but she's not—" He stopped. "My name is Gideon Mercer. I came from Rawlins, before that from Nebraska. I lost my farm, crop failure, then my wife. It's been a hard year. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work. Honest work. Whatever you need doing. In exchange for a bed for my daughter and—" His voice did something he didn't want it to do, caught slightly in a way he couldn't entirely control. "She needs milk. The woman at the inn in Rawlins said she needs milk every day for 2 weeks. I can pay." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the $4.30, all of it, every coin, holding it out in his palm. "Not much, but I've got this." The woman looked at the coins in his palm, then she looked at him. Then she said, "How old is she?" 4. "How long has she had the fever?" "Going on 10 days now. It broke 4 days back, but—" "Come inside," she said, and stepped back from the door. Her name was Margaret Holloway. She'd been running the ranch alone for 3 years, since her husband Edmund had died of a heart attack in the middle of a November afternoon. Here one moment, gone the next, leaving her with 300 acres, 400 head of cattle, 3 horses, and a set of debts she'd spent the following 2 years paying off with her own 2 hands. She didn't offer this information immediately. Gideon learned it in fragments over the course of that first evening, in the way you learn things about a person when you're both focused on something more urgent than conversation. The more urgent thing was Elsie. Margaret had taken one look at the child, the dry lips, the glassy eyes, the way she barely stirred when she was lifted down from Gideon's back, and had moved with a calm, efficient speed that told him she'd dealt with illness before and hadn't panicked about it. She'd put Elsie on the settee near the fire, had taken her temperature with a proper thermometer, had examined the color of her tongue and the inside of her eyelids with the matter-of-fact thoroughness of someone who'd had to be their own doctor out here because the nearest actual doctor was 40 miles away. "She's not critical," Margaret said, not looking up from the child. "The fever's low grade now, 3-something. She's dehydrated and she needs to eat." She turned toward the kitchen. "I'll heat some milk." Thank you." Gideon stood near the door, not quite sure whether to sit or stand, feeling the exhaustion of the last 3 days pressing down on him like a physical weight now that he'd stopped moving. "I appreciate—" "Sit down before you fall down," Margaret said from the kitchen. It wasn't unkind. It was just direct. He sat. The chair by the fire was the most comfortable thing he had felt in 10 days. He didn't let himself sink into it the way he wanted to because he was afraid if he did, he'd be asleep in 5 minutes, and he needed to stay awake until he understood what was happening, what this woman's terms were, what was expected of him. Elsie had turned her head toward the fire and was watching the flames with the heavy-lidded patience of a very tired child. "Papa," she said, "right here. This house is nice." "Yeah." He looked around the room. It was, actually, not fancy. Nothing about the frontier was fancy, but it was a real home with real furniture, with curtains on the windows and a braided rag rug on the floor and shelves with actual books on them. There was a framed photograph on the mantel above the fire, a wedding portrait, the man in it young and broad-shouldered, the woman beside him clearly a younger Margaret, with a different expression on her face, softer. He looked away from it quickly. Margaret came back with a mug of warmed milk and crouched beside the settee with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before. crouched at a child's level, not towering over her, and said, "Can you sit up a little for me?" Elsie looked at her. Then after a moment she looked at Gideon. "It's all right," he said. Elsie sat up slowly and accepted the mug with both hands. She drank. She drank more than he expected. The whole mug, nearly, stopping twice to breathe. And when she was done, she held the empty mug in her lap and looked at Margaret. "Thank you," Elsie said. "You're welcome," Margaret said. Her voice had gone different, quieter. Not soft exactly, but careful, in the way you're careful with something you recognize as fragile. Later, after Elsie was asleep in a proper bed, a real bed, with a feather mattress and a heavy quilt and a warmed brick wrapped in flannel at her feet, Gideon sat at Margaret Holloway's kitchen table and they talked. It was a working conversation. She poured coffee and set bread and cold beef on the table and they ate, both of them too practical to pretend that hospitality required delicacy, and she asked him direct questions and he answered them directly. Where had he come from? What had happened to the farm? How long had he been on the road? What kind of work he knew? He told her about the homestead in Nebraska, the 2 bad seasons in a row, the 3rd year when the crops had failed entirely, and his wife Clara had already been sick for months, and the money was simply gone. He told her about Clara dying in June, quietly, without drama, the way Clara had done everything, and about the weeks afterward when he'd barely functioned, barely gotten out of bed, only moving because Elsie needed him to move. He told her about selling everything to pay the debts and still coming up short, about heading west because west was where men who'd lost everything headed, on the theory that the land out here was different, that there was still a chance at something. He told her all of it without self-pity, just the plain sequence of events, because he'd learned by now that self-pity was a luxury that cost too much. Margaret listened without interrupting. She refilled his coffee once. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her own cup. "You said you can do ranch work," she said. "I can do most of it. I'm not a top hand with cattle, but I learn fast. I can build, I can repair, fences, structures, equipment. I'm good with horses. I can do whatever needs doing." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "What I'm about to say is going to sound strange." He looked at her. "I don't need a ranch hand," Margaret said. Not primarily. I can manage the livestock. I've been doing it. She stopped, started again. "The ranch is sound, the debts are clear, but I'm alone out here, and I've been alone for 3 years, and what I need more than another set of hands is—" She seemed to be choosing her words with unusual care, which he suspected wasn't natural for her. "Stability, a real household, someone to share the work of running a place like this, not just the physical labor of it." Gideon watched her. He wasn't sure where this was going. "Your daughter," Margaret said. "She's alone too, no mother, a father who's trying his best but is clearly on the edge of what one person can manage." She said it without cruelty, just stating a fact. "I lost—" She paused again, just briefly, just a fraction of a second. "I had a daughter. She died 3 winters ago. She was 3. A beat of silence. "I don't talk about it much." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pushed at the house, and the house held firm. "What I'm proposing," Margaret said, "is not what you think I'm proposing. I want to be clear about that." She looked him in the eye, direct and unwavering, in a way that said she'd dealt with men assuming things before and had no patience for it. I'm not talking about anything improper. I'm talking about an arrangement, a partnership." "What kind of partnership?" "You and your daughter stay here. You work the ranch, alongside me. Not for me. I want that understood. You help with what I can't easily do alone, which is the heavy building work and the handling of livestock when it gets rough. In return, Elsie gets a home, gets care, gets the kind of stability she clearly needs, gets a—" Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Gets a woman in her life to help raise her." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "And you," he said carefully, "what do you get out of it?" Something shifted in Margaret Holloway's face, just slightly, just for a second. "I get to stop coming home to an empty house," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said, he thought, the most human thing. Not I need help with the cattle or I need the labor, but the plain, blunt truth of 3 years eating alone and sleeping alone and working alone and coming home to a silence that didn't have any give to it. He looked down at his coffee cup. He thought about Elsie upstairs in that feather bed with the warmed brick at her feet. He thought about the $4.30 that were sitting in his coat pocket, which was about 4 days' worth of food if they were careful, which was essentially nothing. This arrangement, he said, how would it work exactly? Practical terms. You and Elsie stay in the house. There's a room at the back that's not used. You take that, she takes the room she's in now. It was a pause. It's empty. Elsie can have it. She moved on quickly. You work the ranch. I manage the finances and the business side. We make decisions together on anything that affects the operation. You're not my employee, Mercer. You're a partner, equal, say. And if it doesn't work, if we don't, get on. Then you leave and you've got a season's wages in your pocket and I'll give you a letter saying you worked here. We'd both survive it. She said this like someone who had already thought through every practical angle. But I don't think it won't work. You don't know me, he said. I've been in your house 2 hours. No. She met his eyes. But I know what I saw when you knocked on my door. A man carrying a sick child 3 days across open Wyoming in October because he wouldn't quit. She paused. That tells me something. He sat with it for a long moment. The fire was warm. The coffee was real coffee, not the diluted substitute he'd been living on for weeks. He could hear the house settling around them, the good solid sound of a well-built structure making peace with itself in the cold. She'll come to think of you as hers, he said quietly. If she's here, if you care for her, she'll... Elsie doesn't hold herself back. She'll love you. She won't know not to. Something crossed Margaret Holloway's face that she quickly controlled. I know that, she said. And when that happens, you can't change your mind. For her sake. She's already lost her mother. I won't let her lose someone else she loves. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't change my mind, Mr. Mercer. That's not something I tend to do. He believed her. He couldn't have said exactly why, except that there was something in her manner. The directness, the unflinching quality of it, the way she'd moved around his sick child with neither hesitation nor sentimental softness, that made it easy to believe she meant what she said. He looked at his hands on the table, cracked knuckles, broken nails, hands that had worked every day of his life since he was 12 years old and still hadn't managed to build anything that lasted. All right, Gideon Mercer said. He woke in the night. He wasn't sure what woke him. Some sound, some animal instinct honed by weeks of sleeping light in uncertain places. He lay still on the narrow cot in the back room and listened, and after a moment he identified the sound. Footsteps, very quiet, in the hallway above him. Then another sound, so soft he almost missed it. Someone crying, very quietly, with great deliberate effort to be silent about it. He lay on his back in the dark and listened and said nothing, because some things weren't his business, and some grief isn't meant to be witnessed, and he understood, with the particular understanding of a man who had pressed his face into a pillow in a Rollins Inn while his daughter slept, what it was to need to fall apart in private. After a while, the sound stopped. The footsteps moved back down the hall. The house went quiet. Gideon stared at the ceiling and thought about what he'd agreed to, and about the small girl sleeping upstairs in a dead child's room, and about the strange intersections of loss that had put 3 broken people under one roof on a cold Wyoming night. He thought, maybe this is the stupidest thing I've ever done. Then he thought, what was the alternative? Then he stopped thinking, and for the first time in weeks, slept all the way through until morning. When he came into the kitchen at first light, Margaret was already up, already dressed, already moving with that deliberate efficiency that he would come to recognize as her natural mode of operation. She had oatmeal on the stove and bread cut on the board, and was pulling her coat off the hook by the door. She looked at him briefly. There's coffee, she said. I'm going to check on the horses. Come out when you're ready and I'll show you the barn. All right. She was halfway out the door when she stopped. Didn't turn around completely, just paused, hand on the doorframe. She slept through the night, Margaret said. Your daughter. I checked on her twice. Fever's down another ½ degree. He felt the thing in his chest that he'd been carrying for 10 days loosen, just slightly, like a knot that hasn't come undone but has shifted. Thank you, he said. Margaret Holloway walked out into the cold morning air and let the door close behind her. He stood in the warm kitchen and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the frost-pale grass and the gray sky going pale pink at the eastern edge. And he thought, all right then, let's see what we can build. He set down his cup, pulled on his coat, and went to work. The first week was awkward in the way that all new arrangements are awkward. Two people moving around each other in a shared space, each one learning the other's rhythms without quite meaning to, each one trying not to take up more room than they'd been offered. Gideon learned quickly that Margaret woke before first light every morning, without fail, without an alarm, the way people learn to wake when there's nobody else to do it, if they don't. He learned that she drank her first cup of coffee standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark yard, not because she was watching for anything particular, just because that was how she started her mornings. Alone, quiet, 5 minutes that belonged only to her before the day claimed everything else. He made a point of staying out of the kitchen until he heard the cup set down on the board. She learned that he worked better when nobody was telling him what to do, that he'd observe a problem for a while before touching it, that he had a habit of muttering to himself while he worked that wasn't talking to her and didn't require a response. She learned that he was good with his hands in the way that people who've had to fix everything themselves become good, not elegant, not trained, but thorough, patient, willing to pull something apart 3 times if the third way held better than the first 2. The barn roof had a soft section on the north side that Margaret had been patching around for 2 seasons. Gideon looked at it for a day and a half before he said anything. That north section's going to come in, he said one evening over supper. Not this winter, maybe? Next one. I know, Margaret said. I can rebuild it properly. If you've got the lumber, or if we can get it. There's timber on the south slope. I've been cutting it as I need it. How are you at felling? Adequate, she said, which he'd come to understand meant competent, but not her preference. You? Better than adequate, he said, which she'd come to understand meant he was good at it, but didn't need to make a thing of it. She almost smiled. He saw it, the movement at the corner of her mouth that stopped just short of completing itself, and he looked back down at his plate. They got the lumber. It took 4 days of cold, hard work up on the south slope, and 2 more days of milling it rough with the equipment Margaret had in the barn. And by the end of the second week, the north section of the barn roof was rebuilt solid, the kind of solid that would outlast both of them if the rest of the structure held. Margaret had worked alongside him through most of it without complaint, hauling timber and holding boards and doing the things that required a second pair of hands, and she was stronger than she looked, which he'd suspected but not fully appreciated until he watched her drag a 12-foot timber uphill on her own rather than wait for him to come back and help. You didn't have to do that yourself, he said. I know, she said. I was there. Elsie recovered slowly, the way children recover from serious fevers. Not in a straight line, but in a jagged one. Better on Tuesday, worse on Wednesday, better again by Friday, but tired in a way that put her to sleep after lunch every afternoon for 2 weeks. Margaret had assumed management of this process with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything, keeping track of what Elsie ate and drank with a small notebook she kept on the kitchen shelf, noting temperatures morning and evening, adjusting her diet as the child's appetite came back. It was not sentimental, it was methodical, and it worked. Gideon watched it happen and didn't say anything except thank you, which he said often enough that Margaret eventually told him he could stop. I'm not keeping score, she said. I know, he said. I'm still grateful. She gave him a look that said, I heard you the first 15 times, and went back to whatever she was doing. What happened with Elsie and Margaret was something Gideon had known would happen, but hadn't quite prepared himself for the reality of. Children don't negotiate their affections. They don't evaluate whether trust is warranted or whether conditions are favorable. They simply respond to whoever shows up consistently, whoever is warm and present and reliable, whoever is there when they wake up and there when they're scared and there in the ordinary, unremarkable moments that make up most of a child's life. Margaret was there. She was there every day, without exception, and Elsie, who had been quietly starving for exactly this kind of steady female presence since June, attached herself to it with the quiet ferocity of a child who doesn't intend to let go. It started small. Elsie began following Margaret around the kitchen in the mornings, not asking for anything in particular, just trailing behind her at a distance of about 3 feet, watching everything she did. Margaret didn't make a production of it, Didn't stop and coo over her or try to turn it into a moment. She just started narrating what she was doing. Now I'm adding the salt, this much. See, not more than that. In the matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, treating the child like a small person capable of understanding practical information. Elsie loved it. She started asking questions. Why does bread need to rest? Why do you put the lid on when it's boiling? What's that smell? Margaret answered each one seriously, without the condescension that adults often used with children's questions. And Elsie bloomed under this treatment the way plants bloom under the right kind of light. By the third week, Elsie was calling her mama, not hesitantly, not as a question. She just said it one morning, natural as breathing. Mama, can I have more milk? And then went back to looking at the picture book Margaret had found for her in a trunk somewhere. A battered illustrated primer that had clearly belonged to someone else once, and which Margaret had produced without explanation or ceremony, simply setting it on the table in front of Elsie and saying she thought she might like to look at it. Gideon heard it from the doorway. He stood there for a moment and then went back out to the barn because he didn't trust his face to be neutral, and because whatever Margaret was feeling in that moment deserved to be private. When he came in for lunch, Margaret's eyes were slightly red at the edges. She didn't mention it, and neither did he. The ranch work was harder than he'd expected, and not in the ways he'd expected. The physical labor he could handle, had always been able to handle it, had a body built for it, broad through the shoulders and long in the arm, capable of sustained effort in a way that sometimes surprised people who looked at him and saw only the exhaustion of the last year. What surprised him was the scope of what Margaret had been managing alone. She hadn't been surviving out here. She'd been genuinely running the operation, making strategic decisions about the herd, managing the accounts, maintaining relationships with suppliers in town, negotiating the sale of cattle in the fall. She had a ledger book that she kept with meticulous precision, and when she showed it to him at the end of the third week, spreading it open on the kitchen table and walking him through the numbers with the brisk, unapologetic directness of someone who hadn't had a business partner in 3 years and was adapting to the concept, he understood immediately that he'd underestimated her. The herd is at about 420 head right now, she said, pointing to the column. We sold 80 in the fall drive, and the price was fair, but not what I wanted. The buyer knows I'm alone out here, and he uses it. How? He waits, she said flatly. He knows I've got a fixed window to move cattle before winter, and he waits until the last week and offers me a price that's lower than the market, knowing I don't have the flexibility to hold out or find another buyer in time. Gideon looked at the numbers. With 2 of us, that changes. That's what I figured, Margaret said. I know a man who bought from ranches up and down the territory. Used to work with him in Kansas. If he's still in the business, he might be a better option. Can you reach him? I can write. Might take a few weeks for a reply. He looked up at her. Worth trying. She considered this. Then she nodded. Write to him, she said, like it was already decided. Like she'd already determined it was a reasonable course of action, and there was no point sitting around discussing it further. He liked that about her. She didn't deliberate in circles. He wrote the letter that evening. 3 weeks later, a reply came back. The man was still buying, still traveling the territory, and yes, he'd be interested in talking terms for the following season's drive. Margaret read the letter twice, set it down on the table, and said, Good. That was it. But there was something in her posture that had shifted, a slight ease in the set of her shoulders, something that on another person might have been called relief. And Gideon understood that the cattle buyer had been a source of quiet stress for years, the particular stress of knowing you were being taken advantage of and being unable to do much about it. The town of Callaway was 11 miles east, a proper town by frontier standards, with a general store, a bank, a sheriff's office, a church, a saloon, and the layered social ecosystem that grows up around those institutions. Margaret had her accounts at the general store. Whitfield's, run by a man named Amos Whitfield, who was scrupulously fair about credit, but not particularly warm. And she made the supply trip roughly every 3 weeks, usually alone, driving the wagon out before sunrise and returning by late afternoon. The first time she made the trip with Gideon, the town noticed. He felt it before he could have described it. Something in the quality of the attention they were getting as Margaret drove the wagon down the main street. Something in the way conversation on the general store porch changed when they pulled up. The slight shift in body language, the exchanges of glances. He was a stranger in a small town which was always cause for scrutiny. He understood that. But this was something more specific, something directed at the combination of them, at Margaret on the wagon seat with a man sitting beside her. Amos Whitfield was polite. He was carefully, precisely polite, the way a man is polite when he's decided not to say what he's thinking, and he addressed most of his conversation to Margaret while noting Gideon's presence with the kind of peripheral attention that wasn't quite ignoring him. "Settling in for the winter, Mrs. Holloway?" Whitfield said, tallying the order. "We are," she said. "Ranch looking all right?" "Better than it's looked in a while," she said, without looking at Gideon, without making anything of it. Whitfield's eyes moved to Gideon briefly and then moved away. "That's good to hear," he said, and the tone of it was just slightly wrong, just a degree off from what the words meant. On the drive home, Margaret stared at the road ahead of her and said nothing for about a mile. Gideon sat beside her and looked at the landscape and also said nothing, because he'd grown up in small towns and he understood the particular way of small towns, and he'd been expecting something like this since the arrangement began. "They'll talk," he said eventually. "They already are," Margaret said. "Does it—" He stopped, chose the question more carefully. "How much does it bother you?" She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which was one of her habits he'd come to appreciate. She didn't give automatic answers, didn't perform emotions she wasn't actually having. "It bothers me that they've decided what we are before they know anything about us," she said. "It doesn't bother me enough to change anything." She glanced at him sideways. "Does it bother you?" "People have been thinking the worst of me since I knocked on your door with nothing in my pockets," he said. "I stopped letting that run my decisions a while back." She looked back at the road. "Good," she said. But the talk got worse, not better, in the way that rumors always escalate when they aren't decisively addressed, when people sense they're being ignored and take the silence as confirmation. Within 2 weeks of that first supply trip, the story circulating in Callaway had evolved from Margaret Holloway's taken in a drifter to Margaret Holloway's living with some stranger from Nebraska, and nobody knows who he is or what he's done. There was a woman named Frances Dowell who was the particular engine of this process, a rancher's wife, who had strong opinions about propriety and enough social energy to broadcast them. She hadn't said anything directly to Margaret. She was too careful for that. But the version of events she was distributing to every household within visiting distance was vivid and inventive, and not especially anchored to what Gideon actually knew about the truth. He heard some of it from a ranch hand named Pete, who worked for the Carver spread 2 miles north, and who had a friendly, uncomplicated nature that made him constitutionally incapable of keeping information to himself. Pete had stopped by to return a borrowed tool and had ended up in the barn with Gideon for 20 minutes. And in those 20 minutes, Gideon had learned, without quite meaning to, most of the current state of Callaway's opinion on Margaret Holloway's domestic situation. He didn't tell Margaret all of it. He told her enough. "Frances Dowell," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Apparently, Frances Dowell once told the entire town that Dr. Eaton's wife had run off with a traveling salesman, when actually she'd gone to tend her sick mother in Cheyenne. She said this without heat, just stating the record. The woman invents the life she wishes were happening and reports it as fact. "What do you want to do about it?" Margaret set down the pot she was holding, turned to face him fully, which she didn't always do when they were talking. She had a habit of conducting conversation while doing something else, which he'd stopped taking personally. "What I want to do," she said, "and what I'm going to do, is go into town next week and tell Amos Whitfield directly that you are my equal partner in this ranch. I'm going to put it in those words, in front of whoever is standing there, so that it goes through the town in the same 24 hours that everything else does." Gideon looked at her. "That'll generate more talk, not less. For a while." "I know. They'll assume. I know what they'll assume." Her voice was flat. "Let them. What they assume is their business. The truth is mine." She picked the pot back up. "I'm not going to manage my life around what Frances Dowell invents in her kitchen." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You sure?" "Mercer," she said, with the particular patience she used when he was belaboring a point she'd already settled in her own mind. "I've been running this ranch alone for 3 years in a county that thought a woman shouldn't be doing it. I'm accustomed to being wrong in other people's opinions." He couldn't argue with that. He didn't try. She went into town the following week, and she said what she'd said she was going to say, in those exact words, to Amos Whitfield at the counter of his general store with 3 other people present. Gideon heard about it from Pete 2 days later. The version Pete had heard from someone who'd been there, already slightly embellished, but largely accurate. Margaret Holloway had walked in, bought her supplies, and told Amos that Gideon Mercer was her partner, equal share, and she'd be obliged if the town would extend him the same courtesy they extended any other working rancher in the territory. Whitfield had apparently said, "Is that so?" with an expression Pete's source described as like he'd bit into something he wasn't sure about. And Margaret had said, "It is," and then she'd paid for her goods and left. Gideon heard this account and felt something uncomfortable and warm at the same time, which he didn't examine too closely. He was grateful, that was all. He was grateful to be defended by someone who didn't have to do it, and he was grateful for the matter-of-fact way she'd done it, without drama, without sentiment, without making it into a thing that required him to feel indebted. She'd done it because it was accurate and because she didn't tolerate inaccuracy. That was all. That was all, he told himself. The weather turned hard in November. Not winter yet, not the full weight of it, but the warnings, hard frosts, nights that dropped low enough to ice the water troughs, a mean wind that had no warmth anywhere in it. Gideon worked the ranch with a focus that left him too tired to think much by evening, which was the way he preferred it. There was always something to do. The fence on the eastern boundary needed restringing. The root cellar needed its door rehung. It had warped and wouldn't seal properly. The horses needed their winter shoes. The cattle needed moving to the southern pasture where there was better shelter. He worked through the list steadily, checking things off, and when the list was done, he made a new one, because a ranch is a living thing that generates its own needs continuously, and staying ahead of those needs was the only way to survive the winter. In the evenings, Elsie sat between them at the kitchen table while Margaret taught her letters. Elsie was 4, still young for it, but she had a fierce, stubborn curiosity about everything around her, and she took to the letters the way she took to everything Margaret offered, with total, unguarded enthusiasm. She would sit up very straight at the table, very serious, tongue pressed to her upper lip, and trace letters in the notebook Margaret had given her. And every time she got one right, she'd look up at Margaret with an expression of such complete satisfaction that Gideon had to look away sometimes because it hit him somewhere too deep to be comfortable with in company. He was sitting by the fire one evening, sharpening tools, when Elsie climbed off her chair and crossed the room and leaned against his knee. "Papa," she said. "Are we staying here?" He looked down at her. Her dark eyes, Clara's eyes, were very serious. "Yeah," he said. "I think we are." "Good," she said, with the definitive simplicity of a 4-year-old who has decided something and doesn't see any need to discuss it further. Then she crossed back to the table and climbed back up into her chair and went back to her letters. Margaret didn't look up from her own book, but across the room, in the firelight, Gideon saw her press her lips together briefly in what was not quite a smile and was something better. He looked back down at the tool in his hands and kept working, and the fire burned steadily, and outside the wind pushed at the house, and the house, as it always did, held firm. December came in without ceremony, the way bad things often do. Not with a dramatic announcement, but with a slow, grinding shift in conditions that you didn't fully register until you were already deep inside it. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days, the creek at the eastern boundary froze solid, and the cattle had to be moved again, closer to the barn this time, where Gideon had spent 3 days building an additional windbreak out of salvaged timber and packed sod. It wasn't pretty. It held, which was the only thing that mattered. The ranch had changed visibly since October. Not transformed. Gideon was not a man who believed in the word transformed, which implied something too clean, too complete, but improved in the accumulated, incremental way that steady work improves things. The barn roof solid. The fences tight. The root cellar sealed properly now, holding its temperature the way it was supposed to. The equipment organized in the barn in a way that meant you could find what you needed without spending 20 minutes looking for it. Small things, most of them, but small things were what a ranch ran on, and Margaret noticed each one in the quiet, undemonstrative way she noticed most things. Not commenting directly, but adjusting, incorporating, building on what he'd done the way a competent partner builds on another competent person's work. They'd developed a rhythm by December, the 3 of them, the particular rhythm of a household that has stopped being strangers and has not yet decided what it is instead. Mornings belong to the ranch work, evenings belong to the kitchen table, to Elsie's letters, and whatever Margaret was mending, and whatever Gideon was reading from the small but serious collection of books on the parlor shelf, books on soil management, on cattle breeding, on the history of the territory. All Edmund Holloway's, he assumed, all well used. He read whatever was there without asking permission, and Margaret never said anything, which he took as permission retroactively granted. Elsie had started to thrive in a way that went beyond the physical recovery from the fever. She had color in her face and weight on her bones, and the particular energy of a child who has finally stopped bracing for the next bad thing, who has decided somewhere in her 4-year-old reasoning that this place is safe, that the people in it are not going anywhere, and that she can therefore simply be a child. She was loud sometimes, in the way healthy children are loud, and she got into things, and she asked questions at a rate that occasionally made even Margaret's patience flex slightly at the edges.
Why does the horse smell like that? Because he rolled in something. Why did he roll in something? Because he wanted to. Why did he want to? Elsie, Margaret said with the particular tone that meant this line of inquiry is concluded, and Elsie, who had become very good at reading Margaret's tones, accepted this with a small, satisfied nod, as if she'd gotten what she needed. It was the second week of December when Gideon made the supply run to Callaway alone. Margaret had a cow in the early stages of a difficult pregnancy. She'd been watching the animal for 3 days, and she didn't want to leave. The supply run couldn't wait. They were low on flour and lamp oil and several other things that you didn't let run out in December on the frontier. So Gideon went alone, which they'd both agreed was entirely reasonable and which neither of them made more of than it was. He left before first light, the wagon loaded empty, the horses steady in their traces, the cold sitting on everything the way cold does in December. Not viciously, not yet, but with the quiet authority of something that knows it owns the season. He made decent time on the road to Callaway, which he'd traveled enough times by now to know its particular moods, its frost-heaved stretches, and its low spots that collected ice. The town was livelier than usual when he arrived, which he registered but didn't think much about. He tied the horses in front of Whitfield's and went in and gave his order and talked to Amos for about 10 minutes about winter feed prices, which Amos was pessimistic about in the way he was pessimistic about most things. Then Gideon went out to wait for the order to be packed and pulled together. He was standing beside the wagon, checking the horse's feet out of habit, when he heard the footsteps behind him. He knew it was bad before he turned around, from the particular quality of the footsteps. More than 2 people, moving with the deliberate, grouped pace of people who have discussed what they're about to do and are now doing it. There were 3 of them. Sheriff Dale Cutter in front, 2 deputies behind him, both of them with their hands near but not on their guns, in the careful way of men who want to convey readiness without committing to action. Cutter was a lean man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 3 decades looking at distances. He wasn't hostile, exactly, but he had the particular gravity of a man about to do something official. "Gideon Mercer," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," Gideon said. He straightened up slowly, keeping his hands visible, because he'd grown up understanding that keeping your hands visible in certain situations was simply practical. "I'm going to need you to come with me." Gideon looked at him. "Why?" Cutter reached into his coat and produced a folded telegram, which he held out. Gideon took it and read it. It was brief. It had been sent from a sheriff's office in Dunbar, Nebraska, and it said that a man named Gideon Mercer, late of Lancaster County, was wanted in connection with the theft of property valued at over $200 from the homestead of a neighboring farm during the spring of the current year. It described him: height, build, coloring. The description was accurate enough to be uncomfortable. Gideon read it twice, then he folded it along its original creases and held it back out to Cutter. "That's not me," he said. "I didn't steal anything from anyone." "I'm not saying you did," Cutter said, with the measured fairness of a man who is trying to conduct himself properly. "I'm saying I received this telegram, and I'm required to act on it. You understand how this works?" He did understand. He understood also that 2 deputies with their hands near their guns in the middle of the main street of Callaway was not a situation that benefited from argument, and he understood, more clearly and more painfully than anything else in that moment, that any violence here, any resistance,
would send word back to Margaret's ranch and would terrify Elsie and would potentially bring more official attention down on a household that didn't need it. "All right," he said, "I'll come." He went. The jail in Callaway was a single stone building behind the sheriff's office. 2 cells separated by a wall, each one with a small, barred window that admitted a mean trickle of light and a constant flow of cold air. The cell Cutter put him in had a cot with a thin blanket and a bucket and not much else. Cutter locked the door without particular roughness, without meanness. He was doing his job and knew it, and said that he'd sent a follow-up telegram to Dunbar to verify the details, and that Gideon should be comfortable for now, and that they'd know more within the day. Within the day. It was mid-morning. A day was a very long time in a cell in December. Gideon sat on the cot and looked at the wall. He thought about the supply run, the flour and lamp oil and dried goods that were sitting in Whitfield's unpacked and unpaid for. He thought about Margaret's cow with the difficult pregnancy. He thought about Elsie, who would be at the kitchen table with her primer right now, who didn't know where he was, who would ask at supper and would be told something that would or would not be the truth, depending on what Margaret decided to tell her. He thought about all of this in a sequence, like a man counting inventory, because thinking through practical things was the only way he knew to manage the specific terror of being locked in a room with no control over what happened next. He had been afraid in his life of losing the farm, of losing Clara, of losing Elsie. Those fears had all materialized and he'd survived them, which was perhaps the most exhausting thing a person could learn about themselves, that they could survive the things they most feared and still have to keep going. He was afraid now of something different, smaller, maybe, in the abstract, more specific, which made it sharper. He was afraid of losing the thing he'd built at Margaret Holloway's ranch, which wasn't his by any formal right, which he had no legal claim to, which existed entirely on the basis of an unusual agreement between 2 people who had each needed something the other could provide. He was afraid that this, a telegram, a rumor, someone else's crime attached to his name, would be the thing that finished it. That Margaret would do the sensible calculation, the protective calculation, and decide that the ranch didn't need the complication of a man with a warrant on his name, real or not. He sat on the cot in the cold cell, and he was afraid of that, and there was nothing he could do about it, which was the worst part. He didn't know that Margaret already knew. Pete from the Carver's spread had seen the arrest from his wagon and had been halfway to the Holloway ranch inside of an hour, because Pete had the unfailing instinct of a gossip who has just witnessed something significant and cannot rest until the relevant parties are informed. He'd arrived at the ranch while Margaret was still in the barn with the cow, and he told her what he'd seen in a rush of words that she'd had to slow down twice before she understood the substance of it. She'd stood very still in the barn doorway for a moment after Pete finished. Then she'd asked him 2 specific questions, the name of the Nebraska town on the telegram and the exact wording of the charge. Pete wasn't sure about the first and was only approximately right about the second, which Margaret noted without commentary. "Thank you, Pete," she said. "Go home." "Mrs. Holloway, I just thought you should. I heard you. Thank you." She was already walking toward the house. She got Elsie settled with her primer and a bowl of bread and butter and told her she needed to go into town on a quick errand, that Hattie, the older ranch cat, Elsie's particular favorite, would keep her company, and that she would be back before dark. Elsie accepted this with the gravity of a child who understood that adults sometimes went places without detailed explanation, and that it was her job to wait. Then Margaret hitched the second horse to the light wagon, the faster one, and drove to Callaway at a pace that was not entirely sensible for the road conditions, and which she maintained anyway. She went to the sheriff's office first. Cutter looked up from his desk when she came in, and something in his expression shifted slightly. Not guilt exactly, but the awareness of a man who understands that a situation is about to become more complicated than it was. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Sheriff?" She stood in front of his desk without sitting down, which was intentional. "I want to see the telegram." "I can't." "I want to see the telegram," she said again, in the same tone, without the word please, because please implied that this was a request rather than a statement of what was going to happen. Cutter looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his desk and produced the telegram and held it out. She read it the same way she read anything, completely, without hurrying, without the performance of urgency, even though urgency was running through her like cold water. She set it back on his desk. "This is thin," she said. "It's a legal instrument from a duly authorized—" "It's a physical description and a name," she said. "There's no detail of the alleged crime, no witness names, no property description beyond goods valued over $200. Nothing in here that couldn't apply to a dozen men in this territory." She paused. "Have you sent verification?" "I sent a follow-up telegram this morning." "When do you expect a reply?" "Could be this afternoon, could be tomorrow morning, depends on—" "Send another one," she said, "to the county land office in Lancaster County as well. I want the land records confirmed. Gideon Mercer had a homestead there, documented, which a thief running from a crime doesn't generally maintain for years." She held his gaze. "You're a thorough man, Sheriff Cutter. Be thorough." Cutter was quiet for a moment. He'd known Margaret Holloway for 3 years, had dealt with her on the relatively rare occasions that ranch business intersected with his office, and he'd formed a clear opinion of her. She was not a person who overstated things, not a person who defended what wasn't defensible, not a person who wasted his time. "I'll send the additional telegram," he said. "Thank you," she said, and the word came out with its full weight this time, not perfunctory, but genuine. She went from the sheriff's office to Whitfield's and paid for Gideon's order and had it loaded on her wagon without particular explanation, in the brisk manner of a person managing logistics. Whitfield watched her with the careful expression he'd been wearing since October. "Heard there was some trouble," he said. "There was a mistake," Margaret said, handing him the money. "It'll be sorted." Some folks say a lot of things, Amos." She picked up the smaller packages herself. "You've known me 8 years. How often am I wrong about something I'm willing to put my name on?" Whitfield thought about it honestly, which she'd always respected about him. He was a man who answered real questions with real consideration rather than just saying what was comfortable. "Not often," he said. "Then we're fine," she said and walked out. What she didn't say to Whitfield, what she didn't show anyone in Callaway that afternoon, was the fear that was moving through her with every hour that passed. Not fear for the ranch, not fear for its reputation or its finances. Fear for Gideon. The specific, unreasonable, poorly examined fear of someone who has allowed another person to become important to them and is now watching that person sit in a cell being accused of something they didn't do and can't do anything to fix except push every lever available and wait. She was good at waiting. She hated it. She drove back to the ranch, unloaded the supplies, spent 2 hours with the cow, fed Elsie supper, put her to bed, told her that Gideon was in town helping with something and would be back soon. Then she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and waited for morning. The reply from Dunbar came at 10 the next morning. She was in Cutter's office when it arrived, which was not entirely coincidental, as she had been there since 9, sitting in the chair across from his desk with the patient, immovable quality of a woman who had decided she was not leaving until she had what she came for. Cutter read the telegram. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the desk and looked at her. "The actual suspect was apprehended in Omaha," he said, 3 days ago. "Man named Elias Connors, 40 years old, matches the description. Confessed to the theft." He paused. The original telegram naming Gideon Mercer was sent in error. They had 2 names under investigation, and the wrong one went out. Margaret held very still. "So he's innocent," she said. "He's innocent," Cutter confirmed. "There's no warrant. There never should have been one. The Dunbar office sent their apologies." He said this last part with the precise neutrality of a man who understood that apologies from a distant sheriff's office did not fully cover what had happened. Margaret stood up. "I'll release him now," Cutter said, already getting to his feet. "Yes," she said. "You will." The cell block was cold in a way that made her furious, quietly furious, internally furious, in the way she was furious about most things, which was without visible demonstration, but with full force. She heard the key in the lock, and then the door swung open and Gideon was standing there, and the first thing she noticed was that he looked terrible, which was fair considering he'd spent the night in a freezing cell on a cot with 1 blanket. And the second thing she noticed was that the expression on his face when he saw her was something she didn't have a ready category for. He looked surprised, not at her presence exactly, but at the specific fact of it, as if some part of him hadn't been certain she'd come. That landed in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. "You're out," she said. "The real man was caught in Omaha. Telegram confirmed it this morning." Gideon let out a breath. Just one, slow and careful, the kind of breath that has a lot riding on it.
"Elsie?" he said. "At home. She thinks you were helping with something in town." She paused. "She asked about you approximately 40 times last night." Something in his jaw moved. He looked away briefly toward the barred window, and when he looked back, his face was composed again. "I should have fought it," he said, and she heard the anger in it, the frustration of a man who'd made a choice not to resist and was now second-guessing it. "No," she said flatly. "You shouldn't have. You did exactly right. I spent the night in there while I sorted it," she said. "That's how it works. You made the call that kept Elsie safe and kept this from getting worse. I handled the rest." She met his eyes directly. "That's what partners do." He was quiet for a moment. In the dim light of the cell block, he looked exhausted and cold, and like a man who had spent the night rearranging his understanding of what he had to lose. "Let's go home," she said. They walked out of the jail into the cold December air, and the street of Callaway watched them go with the full, unblinking attention of a small town that has just had its most interesting story overturned. And Margaret Holloway walked through that attention the way she walked through everything, straight ahead, without apology, without acknowledgement, with the particular dignity of a woman who has already decided that other people's opinions are not the architecture her life is built on. Gideon walked beside her, and the town watched, and the cold hung over everything, and neither of them said a word until they were in the wagon with the horses moving and Callaway shrinking behind them on the road. Then Gideon said quietly, "You sent the second telegram to the land office." "I did." That's what broke it open. That, and the fact that they caught the actual man. She kept her eyes on the road. "But yes." He was silent for a while. The horses moved steadily, their breath white in the cold air, the runners cutting through the thin crust of snow on the road. "Thank you," he said. The same two words he'd been saying since October, but different this time, with a different weight to them, the weight of something that had been tested and had held. Margaret didn't answer right away. The ranch appeared at the edge of the valley below them, the smoke from the chimney rising straight up in the still cold air, the barn solid against the gray sky, everything exactly as they'd left it. "She really asked about you 40 times, Margaret said. "You said that already." "I know." A beat. "I wanted you to hear it again." He looked at her profile against the pale winter sky, and she kept her eyes on the road, and the wagon rolled on toward home. Elsie was asleep by the time they got back. Gideon had known she would be. It was past her hour, and Elsie slept the way healthy children sleep, completely, with the full confidence of someone who expects the world to still be there in the morning. He went upstairs anyway, quietly, stood in the doorway of her room with the lamp turned low and looked at her for a long moment. She was on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, the battered primer on the floor beside the bed where it had apparently fallen. The orange tabby cat was curled at her feet, and the cat opened one eye when Gideon appeared in the doorway, regarded him with complete indifference, and closed it again. He crouched and picked up the primer from the floor and set it on the small table by the bed. Then he stood there another minute just watching her breathe, doing the thing he'd been doing since October, since the fever, since Rollins, counting her breaths, reassuring himself of her continued existence, the deeply irrational habit of a father who has come too close to the alternative. He went back downstairs. Margaret was in the kitchen. She'd put the kettle on and was standing at the counter cutting bread. Not because either of them was particularly hungry, but because doing something with her hands was how she managed things, and they'd both been managing a great deal in the last 24 hours. She didn't look up when he came in. He sat down at the table. He'd been sitting in that jail cell for nearly a full day, which should have meant he was rested, but the cold and the anxiety had taken whatever rest the cot might have offered, and he was tired in a way that went past physical into something harder to name. Margaret set the bread on the table and poured the tea. Real tea. Not the watered-down substitute, the good tin she kept for occasions that warranted it, and sat down across from him. The lamp between them cast a steady light. Outside, the night was deep and cold and completely silent, the kind of silence that only happens in winter in the open country when the wind drops and everything just stops. They sat with the tea for a while without talking, which was comfortable in the way that silence between people becomes comfortable once they've gotten past the stage of filling it out of obligation. Then Gideon said,
I kept thinking you wouldn't come. He said it to the table, not to her, in the low voice of a man saying something he'd been turning over for hours and has finally decided to let out. Margaret looked at him. Why? Because it would have been the sensible thing. A man arrested on a warrant, even a bad one. That's a complication you don't need. You've got the ranch, you've got a reputation to manage, you've got... He stopped. It would have been reasonable to just let it play out. Distance yourself. That's not what I did, she said. No. He looked up at her. No, it's not. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Is that what you actually thought I'd do? Or is that what you were afraid of? The question landed cleanly, the way her questions tended to. Direct, no cushion on them. Both, he said after a moment. Which I know isn't fair to you. It's not, she agreed without heat. But I understand it. She was quiet for a second, looking at the lamp. You've been let down enough times that you've started assuming it as a default position. That's not a character flaw, Mercer. It's just what happens to a person. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to add to that. She'd described it accurately, with the precision she brought to most things, and the accuracy of it was both a relief and a mild embarrassment. When Pete came and told me, Margaret said, the first thing I thought about wasn't the ranch. She paused. I want you to know that. What was the first thing? She didn't answer immediately. She turned her mug slightly on the table, a small, unconscious movement. I thought about the look on Elsie's face if you didn't come back, she said, and then I thought about another pause, shorter. And then I got the wagon. He understood what she hadn't finished saying. He didn't press it, because pressing Margaret Holloway on a feeling she'd half disclosed was not something that ended well for anyone, and also because he was fairly sure he understood it without being told in full, and that was enough. You said you sent a telegram to the land office, he said. I did. How did you know that would help? I didn't know for certain, but a thief running from a crime doesn't file homestead papers and maintain a legal land record for years. If the Dunbar office had done basic verification before sending that telegram, they'd have seen it themselves. Something tightened in her expression. They were lazy, and it cost you a night in a jail cell. It's done, he said. I know it's done. I'm still angry about it. She said it matter-of-factly, as if anger were simply another piece of information worth noting. He almost smiled. Yeah, he said. So am I. The fire in the stove ticked. The cat came downstairs at some point. Both of them heard the soft thump of it landing from Elsie's bed, and appeared in the kitchen doorway, sat down, looked at each of them in turn, and departed again with the sovereign disinterest of an animal that has no stake in human problems. Gideon looked at his hands on the table, the cracked knuckles, the work-dark palms, the scar along the left thumb from a fence repair gone wrong back in Nebraska 6 years ago that Clara had bandaged with more vinegar and severity than strictly necessary, and which he'd been grateful for both times. I want to tell you something, he said. And I want to say it plain because I don't think I'm good at saying things that aren't plain. Margaret waited. When I was sitting in that cell, he said, what I was afraid of wasn't the warrant, wasn't even what would happen if they'd actually held me on it, though that would have been bad enough. He looked up. What I was afraid of was losing this, the ranch, Elsie's, the life she's made here, He stopped, started again. You. Losing whatever this is, whatever we've been building since October. He said the last part with the slight awkwardness of a man who doesn't speak the language of feelings fluently and knows it, who is trying anyway because the alternative is carrying the weight of it indefinitely without ever setting it down. Margaret was very still across the table. That's the first time, she said, that you've said something like that. I know. Why now? He considered this seriously, the way she would have wanted him to, actually thinking about the question rather than deflecting it. Because I spent a night in a cell thinking I might have already lost it without getting the chance to say anything, he said, and that seemed like a bad way to let things go. She was quiet for long enough that he started to wonder if he'd miscalculated badly. Then she set down her mug and said, I need to tell you something too. All right, I had a daughter, she said. You know that. I told you the night you arrived. Her name was Anna.
She was 3 years old. She said it the way she said most things, level and direct, but there was something underneath it that was not level at all, something that had been maintained at level through long and deliberate effort. She died in January of '85. It was a hard winter. You'll hear that about every winter out here, but that one was genuinely bad. She got sick the way children get sick, and the doctor was 40 miles away, and by the time Edmund got back with him, it was too late.
Gideon didn't say anything. He didn't try to fill the space.
Edmund blamed himself, Margaret said. He wasn't wrong to, entirely. He'd waited a day before going for the doctor, waiting to see if she improved, the way you wait, the way everyone waits because you don't want to make the trip for nothing. She didn't improve. She paused. I don't know if I blamed him. I don't think I knew what I felt for a long time after. I just kept working. That's all I knew how to do. Keep working and don't stop long enough to let it catch you. Did it? He said. Catch you? At night, she said simply. At night it always caught me. He thought about the sound he'd heard that first night in the back room, the quiet, deliberate crying in the hallway, the careful effort not to be heard. He said nothing about it. When Elsie called me Mama, Margaret said, and her voice shifted slightly on the word, roughened at the edges almost imperceptibly, the first thing I felt was, it wasn't happiness. Not right away. The first thing was this. She pressed her lips together briefly. This sharp thing, like a door opening onto a room you've kept shut. She looked at him steadily. And then it was happiness. But that thing came first, and I want you to understand that because I think you deserve to know what it cost me. He understood. He understood it completely, with the understanding of a man who had felt something similar the first time Elsie laughed in this house. That complicated interior collision between grief and joy that happens when you've lost something and then found a version of it again and can't quite accept it without also mourning the original. It cost me too, he said, letting her love someone again, being glad about it and terrified about it at the same time. You were protecting her. I'm always protecting her. Something in his voice shifted. That's all I've been doing for 6 months. He stopped. And when he continued, his voice was quieter. It's exhausting, being the only line of defense, being the one who has to hold everything together because there's nobody else. He looked at her. Until there was. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Clara, he said, my wife. She was a good woman, a real good woman, patient in a way I've never been. She could sit with hard things without flinching, just wait them out. I used to watch her do it and think, how does she just sit there with it? He was looking at something past Margaret's shoulder, not the wall exactly, but some interior distance. The farm failing, she sat with it. Money running out, she sat with it. Getting sick, she sat with that too, right until the end. Never screamed about it, never. She just accepted it and kept being herself. Did you resent that? Margaret asked. The acceptance. He blinked, looked at her. It was not the response he'd expected, but it was such a Margaret response, getting at the actual complicated thing inside the simpler-looking thing, that it startled a near laugh out of him. Yeah, he said, after a moment. A little. Is that an awful thing to say? It's an honest thing to say. I wanted her to fight it more, be angry about it. I kept thinking, if she'd just get angry, she might... He stopped, shook his head. That's not how it works. No, Margaret said. It's not. Edmund, he said, was he? He was a good man, she said. He worked hard, and he was fair, and he loved this ranch in the way some men love the thing they've built more than they love the people beside them. She said it without bitterness, without judgment, just accurately. He wasn't a bad husband. He was absent in certain ways, present in body, working every day, but there was a part of him that the ranch had, and I never quite got access to. She paused. I understand now that I spent 8 years of my marriage slightly lonely, and then he died. And then he died. And I spent 3 years more lonely than I'd known it was possible to be, and somehow the second kind was worse. Why worse? Because before, at least there was someone there to be absent from me, she said. After, there was just absence. The fire in the stove had burned lower, and neither of them moved to add wood, and the kitchen cooled slightly, and they sat in it, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have said real things and are letting them settle. "I'm not Clara," Margaret said eventually. Not combatively, not apologetically, just stating a fact. "I know," he said. "I'm not patient. I don't handle things quietly. I get angry and I push back and I'm stubborn in ways that are probably not easy to live alongside." "Margaret," he said. "What?" "I know," he said. "I've been living alongside it for 2 months. I'm aware of what you are." She looked at him. "I'm aware of what you are," he said again, more quietly. "And I'm still sitting at this table." Something shifted in her face. Not softened exactly. Margaret didn't soften. That wasn't the right word for it. But something in the deliberate composure of her expression gave slightly, like a structure showing you where it has some flex in it, where it can move without breaking. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said, and it came out sounding more raw than she'd intended, which he could tell from the slight tightening around her eyes immediately after. "I built this. The arrangement, the practical terms, because practical terms were something I knew how to manage. And it has worked on those terms. The ranch is better. Elsie is... she's thriving, and I..." She stopped. "And you," he said gently. "And I stopped dreading the evenings," she said. Flat, factual. As if this were a piece of data rather than an admission, and maybe for her it was the only way she knew to say it. "I stopped coming into the kitchen every morning, thinking about how empty it was." She met his eyes. "That's not nothing. That's significant. For me." "Yeah," he said. "It is. I'm not trying to make this into something it might not be. I don't know what it is yet." She was being careful. He could see it. Being careful the way someone is careful on ice. Not timid, but deliberate, choosing each step with full attention. "I just want you to know that this is not merely a practical arrangement anymore. For me. It hasn't been for a while." Gideon looked at her across the table, at the lamp between them throwing its steady light on her face, at the dark hair with the threads of gray at the temples that he had noticed early on, and which he'd always thought made her look like exactly what she was. Someone who'd earned their position, someone who'd been through the actual weather of life and was still upright. "I know," he said for the third time. "I've known for a while." "Then why haven't you said anything?" "Because you're terrifying," he said. "And I was waiting to see if you were ready to hear it." She stared at him. And then, for the first time in 2 months of shared mornings and work and supper and silence, and all the unglamorous daily business of two people building something, for the first time, Margaret Holloway laughed. A real laugh, brief and slightly surprised, like it caught her off guard, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth immediately after, as if she could take it back. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting months for that sound and intends to remember it. "Terrifying," she repeated, composing herself. "Deeply," he said, "since approximately the second day." "You didn't show it." "I was raised not to," he said. "My father would have been horrified." She shook her head slightly, not quite smiling, but something around her eyes that was the near equivalent. She picked up her mug. He picked up his. They sat in the kitchen with the tea going cold and the fire burning low for another hour, talking the way people talk when they've finally gotten past the thing that was in the way. About nothing important, about the cow's progress, about what needed doing before the hard winter came, about Elsie's stubborn insistence that the cat had a name she'd assigned and that everyone should use it, about a loose board on the porch he'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. Ordinary things. The ordinary things that make up the fabric of a life shared with someone. At some point she said she was going to bed, and she stood and picked up the mugs and put them in the basin, and when she passed the table she stopped. She stood next to where he was sitting, and she put her hand on his shoulder. Not an embrace, not anything drawn out, just a hand placed on a shoulder with a weight to it that communicated clearly and without performance what she didn't want to say again in words. He put his hand over hers briefly. Just briefly. Then she went upstairs and he sat alone in the kitchen for a while longer, with the cooling lamp and the settling fire and the deep winter silence of the valley outside, and he felt the specific kind of tired that is different from exhaustion, the tired that comes after a long-held breath finally released, after a wound finally starting to close, after a person finally understands that the thing they were most afraid of losing is, for now, still here. He went to bed eventually, and for the second time since coming to Wyoming, he slept through until morning without once reaching for anything in the dark. The hard winter came in January, and it came the way the old-timers in Callaway had been warning it would. Not gradually, not with the courtesy of a slow build, but all at once, like a door kicked open, like the territory had been holding something back for months and finally stopped bothering. The temperature dropped to 20 below in the first week. The creek didn't just freeze. It froze solid to the bed, something Gideon had never seen before. The water simply stopped mid-motion like a painting of itself. The snow came horizontal for 3 days straight, the kind of snow that finds every gap in every structure, that packs into corners and piles against doors, and makes the simple act of getting from the house to the barn a genuine navigational exercise. 2 of the neighboring spreads lost cattle in the first week. He heard this from Pete, who appeared at the edge of the property on horseback, looking half frozen himself, delivering news the way Pete always delivered news, with breathless speed and slightly more drama than the facts strictly required. Carver lost 14 head, Pete said, stamping his boots on the porch. Henderson lost his whole south herd. They got pushed into a draw in that first blow, and he drew a finger across his throat. And the Dowell place, their barn roof came in 2 nights ago, just came straight in. Gideon listened to all of this and felt the particular private relief of a man who had spent November and December doing exactly the work that was now proving its worth. The barn roof was solid. He'd rebuilt it himself. The windbreaks were in place. The cattle were in the south pasture with adequate shelter, with hay stacked against the weeks when the ground would be too hard frozen to offer anything. The wood was stacked deep under the overhang, enough for 8 weeks at full burn. He and Margaret had done the calculations together in October, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the ledger open, working through the numbers of what a serious winter required before a serious winter arrived. They'd prepared for the worst because Margaret knew this country and Gideon trusted her knowledge of it, and the worst had arrived on schedule. The hardest part of the hard winter was not the cold, not the physical labor of keeping livestock alive in temperatures that made every task take 3 times as long because you couldn't keep your hands functional long enough to work quickly. The hardest part was the confinement, days when the weather made going outside genuinely dangerous, when the 3 of them were inside the house together for hours and hours, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but manage one another, which is always the hardest management task there is. Elsie handled it the way 5-year-olds handle forced confinement, which is to say badly and inventively. She invented games that required the participation of adults who were trying to do other things. She reorganized the contents of the lower kitchen shelves twice, which Margaret discovered both times by reaching for something and finding it had moved. She decided that the cat, Biscuit, as she had named him, and Biscuit, it was regardless of anyone's opinion, needed to learn to sit on command, a project that absorbed a significant portion of her energy and produced absolutely no results whatsoever. Biscuit doesn't want to sit on command, Gideon told her, watching this enterprise from across the room. He'll learn, Elsie said, with the absolute certainty of someone who has never actually met an uncooperative cat before and has not yet been corrected by experience. He will not, Margaret said from behind her book. Elsie looked at Biscuit. Biscuit looked at Elsie with the expression that cats reserve for humans who are being embarrassing, stood up, and walked away. "Tomorrow," Elsie said, undeterred, and went after him. Gideon caught Margaret's eye over the top of her book. She lowered it just slightly, and there was a look on her face, brief, warm, very real, that she let him see before she raised the book again. It was the kind of moment that didn't need commentary. It was the kind of moment that was its own sufficient thing, that asked nothing more of either of them than to be present for it. The cattle made it through January. All of them. Gideon checked every morning in the pre-dawn dark, walking the pasture with a lamp, counting heads, checking the animals for signs of frostbite or injury or the particular hollow-sided look that meant a cow wasn't eating. He lost sleep over it. Genuinely lost sleep, lying awake at 2 a.m, running numbers in his head, calculating hay stores against days remaining in the season, getting up sometimes to check the temperature outside because he'd heard the wind change and wanted to know what it meant.
Margaret did the same thing from her side, checking the same animals at different hours, and they developed a system where they compared notes in the morning over coffee, each filling in what the other had missed. It was not romantic. It was the opposite of romantic, in the specific way that real partnership is the opposite of romantic. It was practical and repetitive and occasionally contentious because they did not always agree about what the animals needed, and neither of them was inclined to back down quickly from a position they believed in. "The East Group needs more hay," Gideon said one morning in late January. "The East Group is fine," Margaret said. "I checked them last night. I checked them this morning. The big Hereford isn't eating properly. She's standing off by herself." "She does that. She's always done that. She's particular about her space." "Particular is different from not eating." "I know the difference, Mercer." "I know you know the difference. I'm telling you what I saw." A pause. Margaret poured her coffee and looked at the window and then said, without quite admitting it directly, "I'll check her again this afternoon." "That's all I'm asking," he said. She checked. The Hereford was fine, as it turned out. Particular about her space, as Margaret had said, but she'd put out extra hay anyway, just on the side of caution, and neither of them mentioned it again because there was nothing to mention. That was how it worked between them by January. They disagreed and they pushed back and they each held their ground long enough to be sure they were right. And when one of them was wrong, they adjusted without theater and moved on. Because the winner didn't care who was right, and the cattle didn't care either. And the only thing that mattered was the outcome. It was the hardest winter the territory had seen in a decade, and the Holloway Ranch came through it with the full herd intact. The same could not be said of their neighbors. Henderson had lost nearly a third of his cattle. The Carver place had lost the use of their main barn when the structure showed serious damage under the snow load in February. The Dowell Ranch, Frances Dowell's ranch, the woman who had spent the previous autumn generating detailed opinions about Margaret Holloway's domestic arrangements, had come through worst of all, with 2 barns damaged, significant cattle losses, and a broken arm sustained by Frances's husband when he'd slipped on the ice outside their door in early February. Gideon heard about the Dowell situation from Pete in the first week of March, when the worst of the cold had broken enough that travel was possible again. He sat with it for an afternoon, thinking about it in the way he thought about things. From multiple angles, testing how he felt about each one, not rushing to a conclusion. That evening, after Elsie was in bed, he said to Margaret, "I heard the Dowell place had a rough winter, real rough." Margaret was mending a split seam in one of his work shirts. She didn't look up. "I heard the same. Their south barn is damaged. They lost a lot of cattle." "I know." "We made it through clean," he said. "More than clean. We're in better shape than we were in October." She looked up at him then. She'd already understood where this was going. He could tell. She'd probably gotten there before he'd finished the first sentence. That was Margaret. "You want to offer help," she said. "I think it's the right thing to do." She looked at him for a long moment. He knew what she was thinking. He knew Frances Dowell, knew what Frances Dowell had said about her household all autumn, knew that charity offered to the Dowell Ranch would be in no way a simple or comfortable transaction. Margaret was not a person who performed forgiveness. She didn't have that particular strand of grace in her. She was too honest for it, too aware of her own responses to pretend to emotions she wasn't having. "It's also the strategically sound thing to do," he added, because he knew her well enough by now to know she responded better to the full picture rather than only the moral dimension of it. "We have standing in this county now with the herd we've brought through. How we use that standing in the next few weeks will determine how people see this ranch for years." "I'm aware," she said. She looked back at the shirt, took 2 stitches. "Send Pete over to tell them we have hay to sell, at a fair price, and that if they need an extra hand for the barn repair, you're available." She paused. "Sell, not give." Frances Dowell has enough pride that charity would stick in her throat. It was exactly right. He'd known she'd get there, had known, really, that she'd already gotten there before he'd raised it, that she'd been sitting with the same information and the same calculation and had simply been waiting to see how he'd approach it. "Yeah," he said. "That's how I'd do it." "Then do it," she said, and went back to the shirt. Frances Dowell came to the ranch herself 3 days later. She came alone, in a wagon, which took some courage given the road conditions and more courage given everything else. Given what she'd spent the autumn saying, given that she was coming to the place she'd spent months treating as a subject for speculation. She was a compact, sharp-featured woman in her 50s, and she climbed down from the wagon with the careful dignity of someone who has decided to do a difficult thing and is going to do it properly or not at all. Gideon met her at the yard. Margaret came out onto the porch but didn't come down the steps, which he suspected was as much grace as Frances Dowell was going to get, and was probably more than she'd expected. "Mrs. Dowell," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She said his name with a slight emphasis that acknowledged, without saying so directly, that she knew his name, had always known it, had chosen to treat him as a nameless quantity for reasons that no longer seemed as solid as they once had. "I understand you have hay to sell." "We do. Good price. Fair weight." She looked at him steadily. She had the look of a woman assembling herself for something. "I owe Mrs. Holloway an apology," she said. It came out level without dramatic inflation, which surprised him. He'd expected either brittleness or performance, and she offered neither. "I said things last fall that I had no business saying about her household and her judgment. I was wrong to say them, and I knew it when I was saying them, which makes it worse." She looked past him at the porch. "If she'll hear it, I'd like to say so to her directly." Gideon looked back at the porch. Margaret had come down 2 steps, which was answer enough. He stepped aside. He stayed near the barn and pretended to be doing something with the fence while the 2 women talked, close enough to intervene if he needed to, and far enough to give them privacy. He couldn't hear the words. He could read the body language. Frances Dowell's careful, upright posture of a woman delivering something she owed. Margaret's stillness, which in her was not coldness but the mode of a person listening with full attention. After several minutes, Margaret nodded once, and Frances Dowell nodded back. And neither of them embraced or wept or made anything of it beyond what it was, which was 2 practical women on the frontier acknowledging that one of them had been wrong and the other had survived it. They talked for another 20 minutes about hay and prices and the barn repair, and then Frances Dowell got back in her wagon and drove away, and Margaret came and stood beside Gideon at the fence. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "She's not a bad woman," Margaret said after a moment. "She's a frightened one. This winter frightened her, and I think I frightened her before that, a little, because I didn't behave the way she thought a woman in my situation should behave." She paused. "Fear makes people do stupid things." "You're more generous than I'd be," he said. "I'm not generous," she said. "I'm practical. I can't run this ranch in a county where I've made enemies of every neighbor, and I don't want to." She glanced at him sideways. "Doesn't mean I've forgotten. I just don't need to carry it." That distinction between forgetting and choosing not to carry was one of the most Margaret things she'd ever said, and he filed it away the way he filed away most of the things she said that were more than they appeared to be on the surface. Spring came, the way spring always comes after a hard winter, not gently, not with the sudden warmth of something forgiving, but tentatively, in fits and starts, a warm week followed by a hard frost followed by mud so deep it swallowed a boot whole if you weren't paying attention. The creek thawed and ran high and brown with snow melt. The grass came back tentatively at first, pale and thin at the edges of the south pasture where the cattle had been hardest on it, then thickening through April into something real, something green that made the horses restless to be out of the paddock. Gideon was rebuilding the east fence in the 2nd week of April, a section that had taken damage from a downed tree branch in February, when Margaret came out across the field toward him. This was not unusual. She came and went from whatever he was working on throughout the day, checking progress, offering a different approach occasionally, sometimes just looking at what was being done before moving on. He'd stopped finding it intrusive after the first 2 weeks, had come to understand it as her way of being connected to the full operation, of keeping the whole ranch inside her awareness at once. But she wasn't moving the way she normally moved, that efficient, purposeful stride that covered ground without seeming to rush. She was moving more slowly, and she had a folded paper in her hand. He set down the fencing tool. "What's that?" She stopped a few feet from him and held out the paper. He took it, unfolded it, read it. It was a letter from the county land office in Callaway. Formal language, official stamp. He read it twice before he was sure he understood it. "The land parcel east of the creek," he said. "The Henderson parcel," she said. "Tom Henderson's selling. He's done. He's moving his family to Cheyenne, his wife's family is there, and after this winter he's had enough." She paused.
He's offered it to us first before it goes to general sale. We've got 30 days. The Henderson land was 80 acres of good grass, creek-fed on the eastern side, with a small stand of timber that would provide building material and windbreak for decades. Gideon had looked at it since October, the way you look at things that are close to what you have and would make it better. He'd never said anything because it hadn't been available, and there was no point speculating about land you couldn't have. The price? He said. She told him. He did the arithmetic in his head, comparing it against what he knew of their current accounts, their cattle value, their operating reserves. It's fair, he said, more than fair, for that land. It is, she agreed. We'd be stretched through the summer. Yes, but we'd come out the other side of it with a substantially stronger operation, more grazing, more timber, creek access on two sides. She looked at the horizon, at the Henderson land visible past the fence line, the green of it in the April light. The cattle buyer from Kansas is coming in June. If the herd price holds at what we negotiated last fall, we'd cover most of it by fall. It's a risk. Everything out here is a risk, she said, but it's a calculated one. He looked at the letter again. Then he looked at her. This is your ranch, he said. Your land, your decision. I want to say that plainly. She looked at him with the expression she used when he said something that was technically accurate, but that she disagreed with on a more fundamental level. This is our ranch, she said. We settled that last October. Equal partners, equal say. A pause. What do you say? He looked out at the Henderson land. He thought about where he'd been 7 months ago. The cracked boots, the split sole letting in cold water, the $4.30 in his coat pocket, the child burning with fever on his back. He thought about what it had felt like to stand on that ridge and see this valley below him, the smoke from this chimney, and to think, maybe, just maybe. I say we buy it, he said. She nodded, once, the way she nodded when a decision was made and there was nothing left to discuss. Then she took the letter back from him and said, I'll go to the land office tomorrow. I'll come with you, he said. She paused, looked at him for a moment. All right, she said, and there was something in the way she said it, in the slight ease of it, the absence of the slight guardedness that had been there in the early months, something that told him she'd wanted him to say that, had hoped for it, but hadn't asked for it, had waited to see if he'd offer. He had. He was done not offering things he meant. They married in May. It was not a grand affair because neither of them wanted a grand affair, and because the most honest conversations they'd had about it, conducted at the kitchen table in the straightforward, slightly awkward way they conducted all honest conversations, had made clear that what they wanted was the legal reality of it more than the ceremony. They wanted Elsie to have two parents whose relationship to each other was formalized, stable, named. They wanted the ranch to have clear joint ownership on record at the county office. They wanted, though neither of them said it in these exact words, to be done pretending that what this was something smaller or less certain than what it had become. Judge Harlan Pugh, who rode the circuit through the territory and who was a broad, direct man with a practical approach to the ceremonies he performed, married them in the parlor of the Holloway, Mercer, ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in May, with Elsie present and Pete from the Carver spread, and Amos Whitfield as witnesses, because Amos had been fair to them both, and that counted for something. And because Pete would have been genuinely wounded to be excluded, and there was no good reason to wound him. Elsie wore a dress Margaret had made from fabric they'd bought in Callaway in April, a serious, deliberate project that had involved Elsie's enthusiastic and largely unhelpful participation in every stage. The dress was blue. Elsie had been very specific about the blue. She stood between them during the brief ceremony with the expression of someone who has been told something important is happening and is trying to feel the full weight of it, which on a 5-year-old face was a remarkable combination of gravity and barely suppressed excitement. When Judge Pugh said the words that made it official and asked if they agreed, Gideon said, I do. And Margaret said, I do. And Elsie said, me too, which was not strictly required, but which Judge Pugh incorporated into the record without comment, being a practical man who had seen stranger things on the frontier and had decided long ago that the law was best served by a certain flexibility of spirit. Pete cried, predictably.
Amos Whitfield shook their hands with the firm, approving grip of a man who has decided his earlier reservations were misplaced and is making the correction with full sincerity. Margaret accepted this with more grace than Gideon had expected, which he suspected was because Amos had been one of the people who'd treated her fairly when the town was making its decision about them, and she remembered that. Afterward, there was food. Margaret had cooked, refusing help from anyone on the grounds that she knew where everything was, and it was faster alone, which was true. And Pete managed to drink slightly more than was advisable, and told a lengthy story about a cattle drive in his youth that had only a tangential connection to anything that had happened that day, but which he told with enough energy that nobody minded. Elsie fell asleep on the settee before sunset, still in her blue dress, with Biscuit curled on her feet and the primer face down on the floor beside her, because some habits are structural. Gideon stood on the porch in the May evening after Pete and Amos had gone, the sky going orange and purple at the western edge, where the mountains were, the air warm enough that you could stand in it without a coat for the first time since October. He could hear Margaret in the kitchen, the sounds of clearing up, the ordinary sounds of the end of an ordinary day that happened to also be the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. He thought about the road from Rawlins. He thought about the split sole and the $4.30 and the way the smoke from this chimney had looked from the ridge, that thin column of gray against the sky. He thought about standing on that ridge and making himself walk down toward it, when everything in him that was tired and defeated had wanted to just stop, just quit, just sit down in the cold grass and let what happened happen. He hadn't stopped. He'd walked down. He didn't know, standing on that ridge, what he was walking toward. That was the thing about desperation, the thing nobody told you. It was also the thing that kept you moving when good sense might have convinced you to stay still. He'd had nothing to lose, which meant he'd had nothing holding him back, which meant he'd knocked on a stranger's door and asked for milk and work and a bed for his daughter, which meant a woman who had been quietly managing her own devastation for 3 years had looked at him and made an extraordinary decision that neither of them had fully understood at the time. You didn't plan for things like this. You couldn't. You could only put one foot in front of the other in the cold and walk toward the smoke and knock on the door and see. Margaret came out onto the porch. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which at this hour was habit more than need. They both drank too much coffee, had always drunk too much coffee, and had stopped caring about it sometime in January when the cold made it a survival mechanism rather than a preference. She handed him one and stood beside him looking out at the valley in the evening light. "Elsie's still asleep in her dress," he said. "I know. I'll get her to bed in an hour." A pause. "She'll be furious she missed the sunset." "She'll live," he said. Margaret made a sound that was almost a laugh. They stood on the porch and drank their coffee, and the valley went through its colors: orange, pink, the deep, complicated purple that only happens for a few minutes before full dark takes over. And the horses moved in the paddock below with the slow, settled motion of animals that have no concerns beyond the immediate. And the Henderson land beyond the fence line caught the last of the light in a way that made it look very large and very possible. "The east fence needs finishing," Gideon said after a while. "I know. I'll get it done this week if the weather holds." "All right. And the Henderson parcel. We should walk it together, really walk it, all the way around, before we decide where to extend the fence line." "I was thinking the same thing. Saturday, if the weather holds." "Saturday," he agreed. They were quiet again. The dark came in from the east the way dark always came, gradually and then all at once. And the first stars appeared over the mountains, and somewhere out in the south pasture a cow made a sound and was answered by another cow, and the ordinary world went on being ordinary, which was the thing he'd learned that you were most grateful for when you'd spent any significant time living in the extraordinary. He was not a man given to large conclusions. He'd been suspicious of large conclusions since the Nebraska farm, since the years of believing that if he just worked hard enough, the right outcome would follow, and then discovering that sometimes the right outcome doesn't follow, that sometimes the farm fails and the wife gets sick and the child runs a fever, and you end up walking across Wyoming in October with $4.30 and a split boot sole. Large conclusions led you to think the story was about deserving things. And it wasn't, he'd decided. It wasn't about deserving. It was about walking down to the smoke. It was about knocking on the door when you were out of better options. It was about what you were willing to do with whatever opened up on the other side. Margaret's hand found his on the porch rail. Not dramatically.
She just set her hand over his the way she'd done it in the kitchen in December, with that same weight to it, that same quality of saying something real without requiring words for it. He turned his hand over and held hers. The stars came out one by one above the Wyoming mountains. Behind them, in the warm house, Elsie slept in her blue dress on the settee with the cat on her feet and the battered primer on the floor beside her, and she was 5 years old and entirely unaware that anything remarkable had happened, because from inside her 5-year-old understanding, this had always been her life. This house, these people, this particular valley where the mountains went purple at sunset, and the horses moved in the paddock, and the woman in the kitchen knew what the cat's name was, and the man on the porch sang badly when he thought nobody was listening. She had not chosen them the way adults choose things, with hesitation and calculation and the weight of everything they stand to lose. She had simply recognized them the way children recognize what belongs to them, immediately, completely, without reservation or review. She was right. It did belong to her. All of it. The frontier doesn't forgive sentiment. It doesn't reward good intentions, doesn't guarantee that the people who work the hardest will be the ones who survive. It takes and keeps taking, and it doesn't explain itself, and anyone who told you different had never spent a January in Wyoming at 20 below wondering if they'd made it to the other side. But sometimes, not always, not even often, the cold road led somewhere. Sometimes the smoke on the horizon was real. Sometimes the door opened, and the person behind it was someone who needed exactly what you had to offer and had something that you needed in return. And the thing you built together out of that improbable starting point turned out to be stronger than anything either of you could have built alone. You couldn't plan for it. You couldn't deserve it. You could only walk toward the smoke and see. They stood on the porch until the coffee was cold and the stars were fully out and the valley had gone completely dark. And then Margaret said, "Come inside." And he did. And the door closed behind them, and the house held its light against the dark the way it always had. Steady, solid, built to last.